Okay, we're going to have some fun because I've been assigned to hold this little recorder to make a recording that will go up on your website when I'm done. So this will be interesting. Well, thanks for inviting me back. I'm flattered. As Andy said, I was last here in 2008. So, Andy, I'll be watching for that invitation in the fall of 2016. I want to keep things intact. There's an old saw that's most often attributed to Abe Lincoln, but also sometimes to Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde, George Eliot, Groucho Marx, and Albert Einstein, among others. You've probably heard it, but it says, "Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt." So I'm going to violate that today. I'm going to do a few bullet points and then go to the slides. I have about twice as many slides as are in the handout. I know I won't maybe not even get to all of the handout slides today, but both the handout and the fuller slideshow are available on my website. It's michaeljparks.com, and just look at past presentations, and you can bring up a PDF of any of them. As an amateur economist, and I am an amateur economist, basically a newspaper man who went straight some years ago, I follow the first principle of economic forecasting, and that is forecast often, even though I only get an opportunity every 4 years at CFA. And of course, the other inviolable rule, give them a date or give them a number, but never ever give them both in the same forecast. And I suspect that many of you know who Richard Fisher, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, is. And Fisher, this spring on CNBC, referenced this disclaimer that he said appeared in 1999 on a Green Book, which is the internal forecast that's used by members of the Federal Open Market Committee before their meetings. And I think it's appropriate to put on the screen before making any forecast. And of course, another one that I get a kick out of, I hope some of you have in your library, the neat little book called the Zurich Axioms, a summation of the wisdom of the Swiss bankers. And this is one, I think it's number 4 of the Zurich Axioms. So just a few comments. First of all, about the U.S. economy, let me say that my take is best house in a bad neighborhood, best house in a tough neighborhood. I had been using the aircraft analogy, which others have used, that we're at stall speed, and 6 or 8 weeks ago I would have said we're at risk of falling below stall speed and falling back into a recession. Today, excluding the fiscal cliff, I would say we are exceeding stall speed, but we're not going fast enough to get us back up to the cruising altitude that we'd like to have. Now, I assume that all of you follow many economic indicators fairly closely, so I won't go through a whole bunch of recent economic indicators. Just let me say that we clearly have put in a bottom on housing. I think that's very much true. We're starting a new cycle in housing. We're not going back to where we were before. And another very relatively strong part of the economy today, and I think will probably be strong going forward, is the American automobile industry. As you know, during the depth of the recession, we dropped sales down to fewer than 10 million units of autos and light trucks, and we have been increasing. Today we're up, I think, 15 million plus annual rate in terms of autos and light trucks. Best house in a bad neighborhood. You know, of course, that Japan, which is the second largest advanced economy in the world, continues to be stuck, as it has been for 2 decades, at a rate of growth that barely registers. And again, this sophisticated group, I'm sure, certainly knows that Japan has twice the level of debt in relation to GDP as does the United States. It does have the blessing that most of its debt is financed domestically as opposed to ours. But Japan has other problems, including an enormous demographic problem, which features a population that has been shrinking for about 5 years and will take Japan to the status of a second level power in the not too distant future. You know that the Eurozone contracted in terms of its economic growth in the third quarter, with very modest growth in France and Germany, offset by declines in output in Italy and Spain, and obviously some of the peripheral economies. The economy of the UK contracted in Q2, but it expanded in Q3, leading some wags to suggest that the UK ought to have an Olympics every quarter and commemorate the Queen's 60th anniversary every quarter. There's no question that we have some very serious economic problems in the U.S. As of October, 4.3 million fewer payroll jobs than in January of 2008. You'll see it in a slide if I get to it, but look it up online, and of course it's on your Bloomberg. A labor force participation rate that has been declining for more than a decade, and we would have much higher unemployment if that labor force participation had not been declining. So the unemployment rate would be much higher otherwise. So best house in a tough neighborhood, the only rich country, the only member of the G7 that is doing better than the United States currently in terms of its economic growth is Canada. And Canada is roughly a 20th the size of the U.S. Now, I have no idea whether the U.S. will go over the fiscal cliff. If I had to make the call today, I would say yes. And you know that if nothing is done, we're talking about spending cuts and tax increases that amount to something close to 4 to 5% of GDP, and would obviously pull a U.S. economy that's growing at 2% into a recession. Your guess on the fiscal cliff issue is as good as mine. Aside from the issue of the fiscal cliff, the main obvious risk to the U.S. economy, it seems to me, and no surprise to you, are external. Can China manage a soft landing? Can it manage a political transition? And the one thing that I want to say about China, and I'm sure you stay up to date on what's going on, a very significant development in China is that those who are able to are getting their money, their children, their families out of China, establishing beachheads in the Western world, and they're looking for things that are not currently on offer in China, including political freedom, including clean water, clean air, safe food, and a more assured future for their children. So China's one big one. Will the Eurozone as we know it today be around this time next year or 2 years from now? I doubt that Greece will be in the Eurozone on January 1st, 2021-14. But my hunch, which is mainly informed by reading, I'm a ferocious reader. I consume everything I could get my hands on. My hunch is that Angela Merkel has decided that the cost of disintegration is higher than the cost of staying. Germany will pay. Germany will have a stronger say in the other members of the Eurozone, but Germany will keep the Euro together. Martin Wolf, who is the chief financial commentator of the Financial Times and who's on book leave, and I'm missing him. He's only been on book leave for a couple of weeks. He is my touchstone and my guidepost on the future of the Euro, as on much else. And he says that in order for the euro to remain viable, the debtors, Greece, Spain, Italy, need a credible path to economic growth which will allow them to discharge their debts, while the creditors need some assurance that they're not throwing good money after bad. And the last time Wolf wrote about this, he said that neither is on offer today. Point number 3, if you're a pessimist or a skeptic, you don't have to look far these days for material. I'm sure you all know the name Ray Dalio. In the Financial Times, Dalio was quoted recently as saying that the globe is only 5 years into a deleveraging process that may last for another decade. Conditions in the U.S. and the U.K., he said, will be merely tolerable, while countries on the edge of Europe will experience a depression. One of his colleagues, a fellow by the name of Robert Prince, who is the co-chief investment officer at Bridgewater, was quoted in the Journal in January as saying that Bridgewater is preparing for at least a decade of slow growth, high unemployment in the advanced economies. Jeremy Grantham, does that name ring a bell? Or are you on his list? I was just looking at his latest quarterly, which came out, I think, overnight, but essentially making the same kind of argument, and a line in there which I'm hearing increasingly, a question of whether the kind of growth that we have become accustomed to just is not within reach going forward. Martin Wolf, among others, as well as Robert Samuelson, who writes for Newsweek and the Washington Post, and who is one of the best kind of writers, best journalist writers on economic questions. Both of them recently have written columns essentially asking the rhetorical question, is growth over? Are we done with the kind of growth that we had in the Western world in the past few years? And they based their columns on a paper which was presented at Jackson Hole in August by, and I can't remember the fellow's name, but a paper that's available on the website of the National Bureau of Economic Research. So, while the U.S. is in better shape than Europe and Japan, we have to acknowledge that in common with all rich countries, we have structural deficits that are driven by living longer and especially by rising health care costs. That's a whole nother talk, but it was neatly summarized for me by a fellow by the name of David Leonhardt, and I hope you read his stuff, economics writer for the New York Times. Leonhardt wrote earlier this year, essentially, all affluent countries are facing sharply increasing claims on their resources, even as those resources are growing less rapidly than they once were. And an important point here, this is from Wolf. He said, everybody knew a fiscal squeeze was coming for the rich countries, but the fiscal squeeze was jerked forward by about a decade by the financial crisis in 2008, when governments had to do two things. They had to spend a lot of money to buck up their banking systems, and also had to spend a lot of money to try and replace some of the demand that was lost when the economy fell off that cliff in 2008. Best house in a tough neighborhood applies to Washington's economy. When you make your list of things to be thankful for on Thursday, don't forget to give thanks for the fact that you live in the Seattle metropolitan area and the state of Washington. We are advantaged today by what can only be called hiring sprees. And I use that word advisedly, hiring sprees in aerospace at Boeing and at Amazon. Now, do you read all the real estate news about Amazon? I hope you're paying attention. Did you read the front page story in the New York Times in August about something called Amazon Web Services? Amazon Web Services essentially aims to put into the hands of startups, entrepreneurs, people down to a lone wolf or him or her, the kind of computing power that is available today only to the Fortune 500 companies with massive IT departments, and on very modest pricing and on a utility basis, pay as you go, so you don't pay for what you don't use. An example of what some people are doing with Amazon Web Services. There is a company that analyzes the weather for farmers, and it analyzes the weather and then for specific areas and for soil and crop conditions at hundreds or thousands of areas around the United States, and then provides them advice based on its analysis. This company has a half a dozen employees with a few laptops, and it's doing the kind of stuff that simply would not be available earlier. I looked at the Amazon's website this morning. Under Seattle, and not Auburn, we're not talking about pickers who are picking stuff off the shelves at Amazon's warehouse. Under Seattle, there were 134 pages of job listings. If you do a little database work, you can find out there's an average of 20 positions per page. That's 2,700 openings in the Seattle area. And if you look at the job descriptions, these are not minimum wage jobs. Most of them are in the upper end of the 5 figures, and I suspect that some of them will go into 6 figures. The amount of space that Amazon either has or is planning to develop, the last I saw, the Seattle Times estimated it at 6.7 million square feet of office space in Seattle. For comparison, Microsoft owns outright about 10 million square feet of office space in the Puget Sound metropolitan region and occupies another 5 million under lease. Its employment in the metropolitan area is about 41,000. Amazon won't say how many people it employs. In fact, Amazon won't say much of anything that is not required to say. So if they file what they have to file in there with the SEC, and that's about it. They don't even put their names on their building. So they won't say how many people are working for them in the Seattle area, but you can do a little bit of detective work. I've done it, and I'll put it on the screen in just a second. Aerospace remains much the largest industrial employer in Washington. You'll see it in a chart. Aerospace employment in Washington is up by 17,000 in 29 months to just under a little under 97,000. It's the highest in more than a decade, and after software, these are some of the highest paid jobs in the economy. The average pay in aircraft manufacturing, the number comes off the employment reports that employers are required to file with the state. Aircraft manufacturing Q1 2012 up over 120,000 per year. So lots and lots of dough. Per Arizona State's Blue Chip Economic Update, Washington was blessed with more manufacturing jobs, more manufacturing job growth in the 12 months through September than all but 2 states. So Washington, number three after South Dakota, which has 9% as many manufacturing jobs as Washington, and number 3 after Oklahoma, which has fewer than half as many. The only other large states that were in the top 10 are all auto states: Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Overall, we were number 8 among the states in total employment gain over the 12 months. You'll see it in a slide. Overall, since the start of the Great Recession at the beginning of 2008, Washington shares an attribute with the mythical children of Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon. So since 2008, mostly above average. Now, aside from the global and national headwinds that we're all familiar with, risks that apply to almost all states. There are some risks that are unique to Washington State. One of the biggest that may not be widely recognized is the opening of the widened Panama Canal in 2014. You all know that most of what goes through here is headed someplace else, and the widened canal will make it possible for much larger ships to access the Gulf Coast and the East Coast ports. Now, the last point I wanted to make before I go to the slides, and I'm going to stick my neck out here in a way. This one doesn't stick my neck out. I think it's obvious to most of you. I think the bond market is a huge bubble, and I certainly want to be out of the way when the bubble bursts. But the other thing that I will say is that I think that the United States, one way or the other, will eventually default on its obligations. The default probably will be informal and will not be called that when it occurs. I think you could make a decent argument that NZIRP, the near zero interest rate policy, is a form of default in that it transfers income and wealth from one generation to another. And my thinking on this is informed, as is most of my thinking, by widespread reading. Here's a headline that appeared in the Financial Times on February 15th, which was Thursday, wasn't it? Is that if I have the right day? It's time to think the unthinkable on America's debt. Will the U.S. request a bailout? Will the IMF grant it? On what terms and conditions? What write-downs of U.S. debt will be needed to restore sustainability to its fiscal accounts? What impact will this have on world financial markets? The second paragraph, these are not questions being asked today, but they're questions worth contemplating. Thinking the unthinkable is one of the lessons of the Eurozone saga. Another lesson is the speed with which complacency can become a crisis. The writer is Robert Jenkins, who is an external member of the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England and a former hedge fund manager, former money manager. So when you start to see those sorts of things in the mainstream press, you have to wonder. So with that, let's go to some slides just for fun. We obviously live in extraordinary times. So. And you know, things are fantastic or frightening, or you make up your own abbreviation for that. And this one is not in the handout, but essentially Ben Bernanke said money is free. We've got all these QEs. We've got the U.S., Japan, the ECB, and even the Swiss. You know, the Swiss, not too many months ago, made a statement that no central banker wants to make. The Swiss said, we will buy in unlimited quantities, whatever you throw at us, in order to fix the exchange rate. So even the Swiss are printing money. And as you know, yields have gone negative in the U.S., Germany, and Japan. I don't think, I'm not sure what you think about this proposition, but certainly people don't trust Europe's banks. And again, this is informed by reading. Europe's banks are much larger in relation to the size of the European economy than American banks. And an important point here is that American banks have gotten ahead of the curve with a lot of prodding. I would say that American banks are in much better shape than the European cousins. And of course, you deal with it every day, a shortage of safe places to put money and some kind of interesting things. I find this fascinating, that in Tiffany and Burberry stores in New York City have hired Mandarin speakers, and this, I think, made the front page of the, maybe the front page of the business section of the New York Times a while back. A producer of a high-priced toilet in Wisconsin someplace, $6,400 for a high-tech toilet. It's on back order, and most of the buyers are Chinese. So now, this one is in the handout, so I won't read it. Obviously, you're familiar with the concept of the black swan. What's the disruption that we cannot foresee? This is not in the handout, but I kind of have fun with this one. We live in a great time, right? We had the Great Recession from January of 2008 to June of 2009. The Great Disappointment, which is what I call what we have experienced subsequent to July of 2009, and of course the Great Repression. Central bankers around the world repressing interest rates, preventing, many would argue, preventing a repeat of a Great Depression, but also think about, despite this repression and despite all the stimulus, we still have most of the world growing at relatively slow rates. Does the name Roger Altman mean anything to you? Roger Altman, a rare Democrat on Wall Street. And Roger Altman, this slide is inspired by an essay in the Financial Times back in September. So what could go right? Altman says housing could go right. He said we're putting in a bottom, and actually things are going to get quite a bit better in terms of housing. You have read our friend at IHS Global Insight, his name escapes me, but the big shot in energy, talking about how the United States is becoming a leading power in energy. It's going to give our manufacturers a lot of advantage. Banking, the argument here is the point I mentioned, that American banks are in better shape. They're going to be able to make loans when the time comes. There's a outfit out of Boston, the Boston Consulting Group, which has been writing about this concept of reshoring, manufacturing operations coming back to the United States, partly because of this growing energy advantage. All of the studies are available on the internet. One line from the Boston Consulting Group study that I remember is that in 4 or 5 years, the United States will have advantages against Germany, France, and Italy, 5 or 6% in terms of their production costs. So reshoring. And Roger Altman's final point was one which will cause some of you, as it did me, to wonder if Mr. Altman was smoking some of that which we legalized at our election. So he said, it could happen. Could somehow the Democrats and the Republicans could get together and provide some sort of a fiscal fix. So Washington highlights, again, it's all in the handout. I'll go fairly quickly because I'd like to be able to get to some stuff that is not in the handout. Amazon, you can't say enough about it. The Sunday Times had the story about unhappy merchants and the fact that nobody can raise Amazon on the telephone. And that's true of mostly all high technology companies. Did you know that? You can't find a telephone number for Google or Yahoo or any number of other. They want you to do it on the internet. So non-farm payroll employment at Washington up by those numbers in a year, and manufacturing doing twice as good as the overall picture in terms of Washington. Obviously a large, growing, and as it says, a diverse technology sector. And something that we often miss in the city is that we have a large, diverse agricultural sector. They're in a great year. And they're in a great year partly because of the misfortune of peers in other parts of the country. Michigan's apple crop essentially failed. Michigan is our competitor. New York's apple crop was very short. So, and our grain growers are benefiting from trends around the world, including better diets. On the other hand, everybody's looking for an economist that won't say, on the other hand, we're no better than we were 6 years ago. So think of all of the output, and the income has been lost by the fact that we haven't had people working. Construction has been ravaged, won't surprise any of you because you follow things. Unemployment rate slightly higher than average, and as an export-dependent state, we're exposed, obviously, to trends, especially in East Asia. You look at a chart, if we have time, I'll get to it, but a chart of China's growth, a chart of Asia's growth, that has to be a concern. If I had to show only one slide, if you said you got to limit yourself to one slide, here's the one. So it's the backlog updated as of the October figures, which were published in the first week of November. 2,900 737s, as you see. 787 has lost a few orders this year, but it's still over 800. They're working very hard to get the production higher on the 87. 7 years of production at the year-to-date production rate. That duration will obviously come down as they get more productive and as they build more airplanes. You probably read either Friday or Saturday the plans of doing a third line at Renton, where they're aiming by 2014 to get the production up to 42 planes a month. And in between the lines, and actually not between the lines, specifically, and in some of the stories, is talk of eventually 60 737s a month at Renton. They now have 10, 11,000 people. They will need more hands at Renton to be able to do that kind of production. The third line will be dedicated to the 737 MAX, a new model with a new engine. Here's our aerospace employment in Washington State, Boeing and suppliers with the machinist strikes in there. Talk about bad timing. Machinists started walking the picket line about 14 days before Washington Mutual went broke and before Lehman went broke. Lehman went out on September 15th. I think the machinists went out on September 2nd or 3rd. But over 29 months, the average increase in aerospace employment has been about 580. And as the slide says, average overall in the aerospace industry, average pay $107,000. In the narrow category of aircraft manufacturing, average is $120,000. I said that Amazon won't tell you how many people work for it. This is the employment in a category that is listed as other retail in Washington's monthly labor reports. Now, there was a little dip in September. September was down a bit, but it started back up in October. The key piece of evidence that this is where a lot of Amazon workers are counted are the differences in average pay. Across the whole retail sector, average pay about $32K. In the non-store retail category, average pay $89K. So this is where a lot of Amazon people are living. Amazon reports once a quarter its headcount in its 10Q, and these are the numbers. They don't tell us this is a headcount. It's not FTE. So some of these will be part-timers, but it excludes temps and it excludes contract employees. These are employees of Amazon.com, and this to me explains a lot of the headlines that you're reading about Amazon and what it's doing in terms of real estate. Of course, software employment continues to be a very important component of Washington's economy, over 50,000, and the single highest paid job category in Washington's employment. Average pay $142K as of Q1 2012. Again, the numbers come right off of reports that are filed with the state. Construction employment, we know that that's the sector of the economy that took the hardest hit during the Great Recession. I guess the good news is over on the right side. You can see we are putting in a bottom and starting to increase. Overall wage and salary employment in Washington State, again, we still short 85, 86, 87,000, the peak, which came in February of 2008. Average pay Q1 2012 in Washington State over all of the economy, roughly $1,000 a week. Here's our non-farm wage and salary, and darn it, on this computer, on my computer, those are red below the line, but that's all right. We have to deal with the differences in Microsoft software. August was a bit strange. August was a decline in terms of our payroll employment, and it was strange because hiring was higher in manufacturing and higher in some other sectors. What the state said was that the weakness was in consumer-facing sectors of the economy. So I say it's kind of consistent with the slow-growing U.S. economy. I said, like the children of Lake Wobegon, mostly above average. So this indexes non-farm wage and salary employment in Washington State and the U.S., puts them both at 100 in 2000. You can see that we underperformed after 9/11 when aerospace and air travel went way down, but certainly since 2005 we have been above average and we have outperformed. I think this is useful to just try and get a sense of where people are working in Washington's economy. So this breaks our total employment down by three sectors, as you see: private, service producing, government, and goods producing, manufacturing, construction, and mining. And with the shares of total employment as of October or September. And then this takes the same data set and indexes again everybody to 100 in 2000. And I guess the discouraging part is that at the end of the period, which I think these are September numbers, government was the only one that was a bit larger than it was in 2000. So government roughly 114, where 2000 equals 100. Private service producing 112, and goods producing rounded 86. So, unemployment rates for the United States and for Washington State, I'm actually a little bit surprised at how tightly they track one another. Our October number was 8.2. The U.S. number was 7.9. How do we compare with our peers on the left coast? Well, this tells the story. On this one, I took us back to 2003, so I picked up the housing bubble, if you will, but you can see that we compare quite favorably in the Evergreen State with our peers in Oregon and in California. You all see the Case-Shiller housing data. Remember, if we went back 12 months, we'd chart all the sand states, and so this shows you where Seattle is in comparison with some of the national index and Los Angeles and Las Vegas. I'm going to skip this one. Washington remains a magnet for population growth. We've grown our population about 16% since the census in 2000, as compared with about 11% for California and about 11% for the U.S. And I think these are in the handouts, aren't they? The economic risks. Yeah. You know, I've covered them. I gave a talk at Seattle University last week, and the question was, what's the role of government? And somebody said, well, how big is the public sector in France? And going on memory, I said 53%. France's economy, 53% of it is in the public sector. Wrong. Last week, according to a report in the New York Times, 57% of France is in the public sector. And this, you know, I love the French. You know, they took to the streets to protest the retirement age being raised from 60 to 62. Quelle horror, right? So, and actually, Mr. Hollande has brought it back down to 60. Do you read The Economist this week? So that the time bomb at the center of Europe about France's problem. So, and of course, the further south you go, the more you get, particularly the untaxed informal sectors, Italy, Greece, and so forth. I think it's important to say that Greece is a sideshow, and Italy, France, and Spain are the ones to keep your eyes on. Both banks and sovereigns, both over-indebted and too big to fail. And the obvious contagion risks, which you are familiar with for the U.S. China, I guess the one point I want to emphasize is the last one. People say China owns us. Au contraire. Au contraire, to use a French phrase. The old joke in banking. Borrow $1,000, the bank owns you. Borrow $1 million, you own the bank. They send shiploads of stuff, big screen TVs and Christmas lights. We send back little pieces of paper saying IOU. So, and this, as the slide says, you cannot run the kind of trade surplus, and they run a trade surplus because they want to keep people from rising up and overturning a corrupt system. You cannot run that kind of a trade surplus without somebody on the other side of the trade. So obviously we have more time in the U.S., but there's no question that our deficits and debt are unsustainable at current tax rates. And then when I went and talked to the Seattle U students, the question was, what role of government? And I showed them, I have it, I think, on the full slideshow. I showed them the slide that shows how many people will be working for each person who is in retirement age. I started in 1970 and I go out to 2050 by 20-year increments with the UN population projections, uncontroversial data set. And they're all declining. There are going to be fewer and fewer people working for each retiree. And so we're either going to have a different level of benefits or a different level of taxation. Now, there are some people who say not to worry. I'm trying to pull up the name out of my memory bank. I'll get it. A economic forecasting outfit who wrote a white paper 2 years ago said, don't worry about this. If the obligations that are placed on people 10 or 15 or 20 years from now cannot be paid for, they will change those obligations. They will shake them off. Jerome Levy Forecasting Center. The white paper is available on the internet. Well worth looking up. So obviously we have problems in Washington D.C. And again, I would reemphasize that point that with interest rates at the zero bound, the near zero interest rate policy, we are in uncharted waters, and the risks are potentially grave. How am I doing on time, Andy?
Okay.
We're doing okay. Okay, let's zip through a few more slides very quickly. These are the G7, the 7 richest economies, indexed to Q4 of 2007, which was the quarter before the Great Recession. And you can see just a glance, the labels are in the order of where they are as of the second quarter. Germany ahead, Canada ahead. We just got even, and the others, as you see. Oh, this is kind of fun. This was an exercise. So you don't have the handout, so this would be a little fun. So these are 4 large economies. Economic growth, 10 quarters through Q2 of 2012, and everybody's going to be on the same y-axis. And I put the label on Q2, so the latest quarter. So there's 1, there's 2, and I'm sure you'll be able to make the associations. There's 3, and there's number 4. So again, everybody on the same axis. So now we'll put the labels on and the size of the economies. The U.S. economy, 15.1 trillion. In Q2, 1.3. Q3 came in at 2.0. There's China, number 2, in nominal terms, and 7.2 trillion. I think the proper term is purchasing power parity. Notice the trend, of course. And of course, Japan, 5.9 trillion, just barely growing. The tsunami is in there in Q1 of 2011, and its recovery in Q3 of 2011. And Germany at the level that it is at. And then just for fun, I pull them all together on the same slide, and you just get a sense. Now, if we went down the list and went from 5 to 8, we'd be talking about Spain, Italy, France, and Brazil, I think. Maybe the UK is in there. And all of those are going to look much more like Germany than they are going to look like China. So the great disappointment, we've had 11 recessions in the post-war period. Before the Great Recession, the 2 longest were 16 months in 1974-75 and 16 months in 1981-82. The chart starts in the quarter after the recession has ended. This is how fast did you grow on a quarterly basis. And you can see by the fourth quarter after 475, we were up to 9%. By the second quarter after 81, 82. So the Great Recession, the Great Disappointment. How long did it take to get back to the previous peak? In the 11 recessions since World War II, on average, peak back to the peak, or back to the same level of the previous peak, on average, 5 quarters. On this one, 12 quarters. Of course, you look at this screen every day, so interest rates being repressed. Economic growth, again, I won't spend too much time on these because you probably look at these screens. This is Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo makes some of its economic research, some of its forecasts available. I was actually a little bit disappointed at the numbers that Wells Fargo is talking about. They're talking about a very weak fourth quarter and a very weak first quarter, and not much excitement in the second and third and fourth quarter of 2013. So, payroll employment change from the prior month. Again, you have these on your screen, so I won't leave them up. There's the labor force participation. In the early part, catching a part of the entry of women into the workforce, but the decline started more than a decade ago, and we are today at the lowest rate in 30 years of people of working age who are actually participating in the labor force. And again, think of this as a lot of wealth and a lot of income that is not being created, can't be taxed, and can't be shared. So it's always fun to compare private versus government payroll trends. Here it's, again, indexing starting in 2008, so at the beginning of the recession and going forward. You can see that the trend, at least in private, is encouraging. And again, all of these slides are available on my website. So I apologize for not handing out everything, but we've got to be respectful of the trees. A Financial Times columnist wrote a column about, he said, "Am I better off than I was 4 years ago?" And in words, he illustrated this chart. He said, "Yeah, I'm better off than I was 4 years ago. Look at the S&P 500 in comparison." But of course, what will be the consequences of all this quantitative easing that we have? I don't think anybody knows. The Fed balance sheet, don't fight the Fed, the chart says, in trillions of dollars. So, and just a couple of, at the end here, illustrating the federal receipts and outlays at the beginning of the period that's charted here, fiscal 2000, fiscal 2001, and fiscal 2002, we were running a surplus. We ran a surplus for 4 years until 2003. Receipts as a percentage of outlays. And this one captures essentially how the financial crisis, remember I said the fiscal squeeze was pulled forward by the financial crisis. The budget deficit as a percent of GDP was relatively modest in the period 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then along came fiscal 2008 and especially fiscal 2009, which began on October 1st of 2008 when receipts went down to about 15% of GDP and expenditures went up to 25% of GDP. The forecast for the out years is from the Office of Management and Budget. I think that does it. On some talks, I say I like to end on an up note, so I go back and I put up the aerospace and the Amazon charts just to end on a positive note. I am by nature an optimist, and I am optimistic, but maybe it's because I'm getting older, because I'm passed into that age group as known as people who are more dependent on fixed income. That has modified my views. You've been very kind to be so patient. If we have, do we have a minute?
5 minutes for questions.
Time for comment or question.
Isn't there a big advantage to the Fed policy in that as you debase the dollar, the cost of servicing, the real cost of servicing the U.S. debt diminishes? So it could be wise from that perspective.
It could be wise, and Martin Wolf would argue that we've seen what austerity, how it works, and we've seen how stimulus works, and I'll take stimulus over austerity. The problem, of course, is that the longer you keep rates at NZERP, the harder it is to get out. Think about the size of that balance sheet. Even a small increase in interest rates would substantially reduce the value of the assets on the Fed's balance sheet. I guess an analogy I used to use was Man on Wire. Did you see the movie Man on the Wire? So, Bernanke's job is to, he's got 2 jobs to keep employment, acceptable and also to keep inflation, but the other under control. So he's got a balancing act. But I also use an analogy of painting yourself into a corner. And the longer you keep interest rates repressed, the tougher it's going to be to get yourself out of that corner. That's the problem I see. The low interest rate environment complicates enormously the jobs of state and local governments, many of whose employees are entitled to defined benefit plans that have assumptions of risk-free returns of 7-8%. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. Financial Times today has an article on how for the first time, more assets of English pension funds are in fixed income than in equity. So a process that they call de-risking. And their concern is to produce a return to match their liabilities. I'm not sure it's a good answer to the question, but the problem that I see is how do you get out of this without upsetting the apple cart, and how long will the people who are at the bad end of the NZERP policy, how long will they be able to accommodate? I don't know. John?
Do you see a long-range threat to the dollar as the exchange currency?
The question is there a threat to dollar as an exchange currency? The answer is yes, but, and the but is, there's not many investable asset classes that can accommodate the global liquidity. The Economist, I think, had the nice line about it. What should China do with all its money? Well, it might buy all the real estate in Manhattan. There's about $300 billion worth of real estate in Manhattan. It might buy up all the professional sports franchises. Problem is that once China becomes interested in an asset class, the price immediately goes up. And the punchline was, China can buy anything that it wants, but it can't afford what it might want to buy. Now, what are the other asset classes? One would be yen, another would be the euro, but after that, the asset classes where you go for the kind of liquidity that is in the dollar, the kind of holdings that are in the dollar, the list gets pretty small pretty quickly.
So, as labor force participation goes down, and the source of many of these people who aren't working has tended to be fixed income instruments, that the income from that goes down. What are these people doing to survive?
Well, I think I think the Fed has forced people to go out on the risk continuum. They have to buy utility stocks, and they have to buy telecom stocks, and they have to buy stocks of Procter & Gamble and consumer product companies that make things that people want to buy. Does the name David Ellison mean anything to you? David Ellison at FBR. I heard a wonderful interview with David Ellison on the radio. I think the fellow out of Los Angeles, Mo Ansari, I listen to him once in a while. Not a bad person to listen to, although the station is terrible. But David Ellison was talking about this problem. He said, they're going to be making a lot of treasury notes and bonds. The price of those is going to be depreciated because of too much supply. He said, I want to own equity in companies that are making things that people want to buy and buy every day. So I think the answer to your question is with bank deposits yielding 0.1%, and with treasuries, 10-year treasuries yielding 1.6, 1.7, you don't have any choice. I mean, and as an individual investor, of course, I'm concerned about losing half my stake again, as happened in 2009, and also about headline risk. Wasn't HP a great American company? And
Right. Okay, but
so what do you do?
My question goes beyond that, because not everybody has investable assets. Many people still live paycheck to paycheck, and labor force participation is going down.
Right.
The question is, what are these people doing to survive?
Well,
you're reading, have you come across?
They're either living off savings, living off supplemental SSI, supplemental social income, living off disability. Disability claims have skyrocketed. Social Security disability claims have skyrocketed, or they're mooching off their families, and those who can't do any of those are living under the freeway bridge. I mean, that's all I can say.
That wraps it up. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
I want to point out, for those of you who are not in compliance, at the middle part of December, we have a compliance update with some very knowledgeable folks in that area. So you need to know, you or your firm, about what's happening with the latest regulations for audits and that sort of thing. Please come to the compliance. Next week, we have a quantitative easing presentation, and then a couple weeks after that, a investment forum on China and India. Hope to see you at those events. Marcia.
I just wanted to remind people that we had to change the date of the book club because we want to party with our friends on the 5th of December. So we are going to meet on the 12th. And the group picked this book, Currency Wars, by James Rickard, that is in paperback. And I actually was able to get this in Barnes & Noble, but it's on Amazon or whatever. Then we're going to read, you better start reading. It's a really long book. It's a very important book. And I think it's called It's Different this Time. and it's 800 years of financial crises history, and it's really worth it. It's a long book.
Reinhard Rogoff.
Yes,
Reinhard Rogoff.
and we're going to do that one in the new year, but it's a long book, so you want to get started.
I realized I sat down.
Stacks.
Yeah.